Alright, I'm hopping on the bandwagon. Lots of fans have been getting super nostalgic now that the Overwatch 1 era has come to a close for the Overwatch League. I've seen rankings for all sorts of different things out there, but the most popular of which has to be the ranking of every single season. As someone who has been around since the very beginning, it seemed like this could be a fun way to just reminisce from my point of view. I have loved every single season, let me make that absolutely clear, but some definitely were more enjoyable than others. This is my list from least favorite to absolute favorite. Oh, and if you're looking for some objective opinion that you think every fan shares, then you've come to the wrong place, my friend. I'm only speaking for myself here. Whether you agree or disagree is totally up to you, but I'm not trying to be right here, so keep that in mind. So, how about we get into the show? Starting off with my least favorite season, I gotta go with Season 3. For what it's worth, I had a lot of fun with content in 2020. It was my first full year of making monetized videos, but man did this year have some crazy ups and downs. A year that could have been so much more got absolutely ravaged by the pandemic. Think about what Season 3 could have been had COVID not been a thing. We had like 5 weeks of homestands, which were all amazing, but we never got a single homestand in either Asia or Europe, and I can only imagine how ridiculous a Seoul Dynasty or Paris Eternal homestand would have been because their fans go absolutely hard. Even here in the present, I still think about what could have been with a global league where these players got to travel across the world. Think about how crazy things could have been if we had the Final Four in Korea, but with a live audience. Just imagine how nuts those fans would have went if they got to see the Dynasty upset the Dragons and make the grand finals. And what about the players? I'm sure some of those guys would have thrived in a LAN environment. I really would have loved to see the Valiant at a few more of those things because I feel like they would have made for a sick road warrior underdog. I'm glad we even just got a few weeks worth of homestands, those were all great, but I think we only really scratched the surface of the potential. Instead, we got stuck with the whole online format, which definitely takes away from the whole excitement factor. The games were still enjoyable, yes, but it always felt like something was off. And I mean, with everything being online, that means that technical difficulties are a lot more prone. Server issues, people lagging out of games, OBS and the occasional choppy frame rate, and just general increases in stoppages in play. There's nothing the league can do about a worldwide pandemic, but it still really took a lot of life out of the season. The pandemic in general put people in a worse mood. It was a tough year for us all. There were also concerns of Overwatch League's ratings going down and stuff, and that certainly dampened the mood as well. There were issues that came with swapping to YouTube, you gotta think about that. It was a real turnoff for a lot of Twitch lovers. There were a bunch of issues going on. I think that YouTube streaming is improving at a pretty rapid rate, but there's something that's very special about Twitch. It's never really been the same since the swap in a lot of people's opinions, and Season 3 had to take those initial reactions head on. For a long time, there was no system to earn League tokens, which really sucked. It was very rewarding to earn those things and, buy some fancy new skins. I mean, hell, you could even get random 100 token drops at the time if you were lucky. But it took months to get a reward system up and running, and even that wasn't great. It had its issues of its own, which led to a lot of unhappy viewers. Something else I definitely missed was the All Access Pass. I purchased that thing during the 2019 season, and it was so amazing. Being able to watch a game live from any player's point of view was incredible. It gave the viewer just a lot of power and the ability to kind of have an educational stream while also enjoying themselves by watching their favorite players. The viewer experience as a whole took a major step back. No live audiences, lack of in-stream rewards, no unique viewing features, and just more problems in general with the stream quality. In terms of the gameplay itself and the general outcome, it was okay. It had its moments. I think a few of my favorite games ever actually came out of 2020. A couple of those Philly versus Paris matches were absolutely insane, and you've got the Shanghai versus Seoul Melee as well, and from the perspective of an LA Valiant fan at the time, 2020 was fun. There were some ups and downs for sure, but the triumphant moments were so great. Moments that got me excited included beating Dallas in Week 1 in front of their own audience, upsetting the Shock, beating Florida 3 different times, and beating Paris in the Melee. My bar was set so incredibly low, but they blew away my expectations, which led to a very pleasantly surprising and enjoyable year. Something else that was pretty fun were the tournaments. Bringing those back after getting rid of stages really did help draw some interest back into the game. The Melee and Summer Showdown were quite enjoyable, and the fact that there were incentives for doing well made it all the more interesting. But at the same time, again, COVID kind of ruined what these could have been too. No inter-regional play until the playoffs was very depressing. It kind of kept ourselves asking who the best team in the league was constantly. Was it the Dragons, the Fusion, the Shock, or somebody else? There was no true way of knowing for sure until the Final Four, which was a little bit annoying. Overall, tournaments were a great addition, but just thinking about the lopsided number of teams in each region did make it kind of weird at times. I think going 13-7 was very bizarre. Technically, we did have a good split at 12-8 before the Vancouver incident, but god was it weird from there on out. I liked the idea of regions for the sake of player comfort and operating in the right place, and I also liked that there were more opportunities for non-US audiences to watch games on a normal time, but I just felt like the whole system in place was a little funky, kind of unequal if you will. The other thing I wanted to touch on with Season 3 was the playoffs. Overall, they were very entertaining. I think teams like the Justice and Dynasty made things extremely interesting. But the thing is, the playoff format as a whole was pretty silly. Some teams who shouldn't have even qualified were winning a bunch of games. I mean, Washington won like 5 different games total when they only won 4 in the entire regular season. I get that COVID called for drastic measures, but it made the regular season feel almost meaningless for those teams who actually performed well. Despite slight advantages with picking your opponents, the good teams weren't really getting rewarded. They earned their playoff spot, they worked hard, and yet they're competing with these teams who finished 15 plus places behind them in the standings. There wasn't really anything the league could do about it since they needed to have some sort of playoff bracket in both regions, but I feel really bad for those top teams still. And speaking of feeling bad for teams, we have to bring up the whole hero pool thing, because that system they had in the first year was not very good. The meta was just changing way too often, and it led to a lot of extra stress and confusion for just about everybody in the team environment. I definitely do appreciate the idea of keeping what's being played fresh. Don't get me wrong, some of those weeks were very exciting. That first week where Soldier got some love was awesome, but usually these hero pools didn't do much of anything. The randomness led to the same characters just getting banned over and over again. And after a while, Double Shield kind of just became the norm. Things were somehow consistent, but also inconsistent at the same time. I don't know how I can like and hate something, it's kind of weird. But yeah, that's basically all I have to say about Season 3. There's a lot of great moments, but I think my viewing experience was at its lowest during this time. Coming in at third place now is going to be Season 4. I really think that this year was basically just a much improved version of Season 3. I definitely enjoyed this year more from start to finish. The league lived and learned from the pandemic, and I think the result was a more pleasant and engaging viewer experience. There were still technical difficulties, of course, but it seemed to me like it was better compared to 2020. Along with that came a better time with the whole token drop thing. There weren't nearly as many issues, and the integration was a lot cleaner. There was still no all-access pass, which is a bummer, but at least they improved upon the token system thanks to YouTube. In addition, there was actually a way to clip stuff, which helps make the experience, just a bit more like Twitch. The league went really hard at improving the whole YouTube experience, and they were definitely successful. Then there's the whole hero pool thing. The league greatly improved upon that system from the previous year. It felt way more organized, and it didn't overstay its welcome either, since it was only in play for 2 of the 4 stages. And the fact that they stayed the same for the entire month also made for some better consistency. The metas themselves were also a lot better in my opinion. Things ran way more smoothly, leading to a more enjoyable experience. Speaking of good experiences, the level of competition stayed at a great place. It didn't see any sort of significant drop compared to Season 3. In fact, some places saw a major increase. Think about the Chengdu Hunters. This was the first year where a Chinese squad truly put out a top-level performance. Then there's also the Paris Eternal, who became the first semi-successful EU roster. There was great progression from a competitive standpoint. There were obviously a few bad teams, but that's every year. We always have some duds in there. But honestly, the poor performances of Vancouver, the Valiant, and London kind of had its own entertainment value to it. For a long time, we kind of just had this race going on to see who would win the first game. I mean, the Titans really went all out to keep us entertained even when they weren't winning. The whole breadsticks thing was amazing. They had us screaming out loud cheering for them because they know that we love memes. And think about it also from the other side of the spectrum. Plenty of teams were relatively solid. We had 3 different teams win a regular season tournament and 9 teams win at least 10 games despite having a far shorter season compared to 2020. On top of all this, we actually got to see some interregional play before the playoffs. Having the NA teams travel to Hawaii for an equal ping system was very smart. It certainly put the NA teams at a tough disadvantage since they were kind of the only ones traveling and putting themselves at risk during a pandemic, but hey, improvement is improvement, and 2 NA teams won out of the 4 tournaments, so that's not too bad. We instantly got to see who truly was the best though, and that was the main thing. There was no need for that pointless speculation like the year before. And that is something I can appreciate. Even if it wasn't perfect, the league was actively seeking ways to make the experience for us fans more enjoyable while also increasing the competitive integrity, I guess you could say, of the league. John Spector and his team honestly killed it. They get 2 thumbs up in that regard. And I think we can all agree that there were numerous good games throughout the year. We had reverse sweeps, upsets, and plenty of map 5s. Some of the highlights of this season for me include Shanghai versus Dallas in the June Joust Finals, most matches involving Dallas versus Atlanta, Chengdu versus the Gladiators in the Countdown Cup Finals, and the Gladiators versus Shock in the Countdown Cup Knockouts, and that's only to name a few games of many. Season 4 kind of went by the fastest in my opinion, but that's because it was very smooth from a gameplay perspective. We had a better grasp on COVID as well, so things stayed in a relatively consistent state. The rivalries, those were some of my all-time favorites, and I was always excited about every individual week. We had lots of talented players and super enjoyable storylines to follow. The storylines are something that deserve extra attention. The redemption arcs were in full force. For one, you have the Dallas Fuel, who finally had a respectable season. Then of course you have the Shanghai Dragons and their incredible journey from start to finish. From 0-40 back in 2018 to Grand Finals champion. I mean, what a transformation. From miserable franchise to the absolute pinnacle of pro Overwatch. And that is only a few of many teams who did something special. Now thinking about this more from a personal experience, I don't feel like I evolved all that much from like a content standpoint. Things stayed consistent compared to 2020. It was kind of stable, but also slow at times, I guess. I absolutely enjoyed myself still, but there wasn't a ton of inspiration to come out with a lot of crazy new content, I feel like. I very much enjoyed bringing back the How Good Is Your Team series back from 2019, believe it or not, as well as power rankings, having those more consistently, and just having more news to cover in general, but my inspiration for those potential one-off videos wasn't really there, but I think the spark will be lit for future one-off videos thanks to Overwatch 2, since we got to see some gameplay from a pro's perspective during the whole Grand Finals, and while it wasn't a lot, just the fact that we got to see reworks for Sombra and Bastion was really hype. That was the exact kind of thing that we needed. So Season 4 definitely was good for that. Overall, 2021 was a good season where I feel like I usually had fun, but was maybe lacking a little bit from a motivational standpoint. Maybe it's because I've been doing this for multiple years now, but the content didn't feel as special. The overly memorable moments weren't as present either in my opinion. Maybe it's because I didn't support the Valiant anymore. Either way, it was still a good year, nothing out of the ordinary, but it ran smoothly, and that's all that matters, at least for the most part. And I say for the most part because this year had its downs too. The big thing obviously came through the whole Blizzard lawsuit thing. It promoted a time of uncertainty for the league as a whole, for us fans, the players, everybody. It only lasted for a few weeks really, but a lot of us were pretty scared, myself included. I mean, I literally made a whole video talking about my frustrations and fears. The league saw sponsorships dip, and Blizzard just had been completely exposed. And you know, that stuff is never gonna go away. The damage has been done. Regardless of if the Overwatch team was directly involved or not, they still have to deal with the consequences since they're part of the company. It's unfortunate that things had to go this way because the league had ran into very little problems up until that point. Thankfully, everything else was pretty good for the most part though. The only other real damper I can think of, in my opinion at least, was the lack of LAN events. Going another year without that high level of energy just made this year feel less special. We got a couple of things in China and that mini thing in Dallas, but it really wasn't much. Just imagine if we had live audiences for the playoffs or any of the regular season tournaments. Oh my lord, that would have been wild. I can still vividly remember the excitement being taken away from us when they announced that playoff LAN events were cancelled. We all remember how much more special it felt to watch the Shock and the Spitfire win the title in front of a live audience. It made it more emotional. It truly is a shame that COVID had to come and just ruin everything, and I couldn't help but feel bad for all those NA teams who had to travel over and over again to Hawaii. They always got the short end of the stick in that regard, but I suppose that's a discussion for a different day. Aside from those things, the league didn't have too many downs. I genuinely enjoyed Season 4 for what it was. If it was a bit more nostalgic and maybe didn't have those issues going on with Blizzard and there were more live LAN events, maybe the season would end up ranking a bit higher on my list. But this is where it stays. Coming into the number 2 spot is the 2019 season. Now we're heading towards super memorable status. Season 2 was excellent in so many different ways. From an unbiased standpoint, this is objectively the number 1 season. Again, this video is from a biased point of view, but if I were to put this list in order from like more of a general fan standpoint, Season 2 would likely reign supreme. It had a better competitive nature compared to 2018. We got more excellent players who should have been in the league earlier thanks to all the expansion teams, and let me tell ya, just having more teams in general was pretty exciting. Then there's the level of organization. There wasn't as much chaos in the meta for sure. I think that things felt pretty organized, and for what it's worth, GOATS was pretty entertaining for most of its lifetime. Stage 1 and 2 showcased some of the most incredible gameplay I have ever seen. Watching GOATS teams perfect this composition was truly special, and while it got old after a while, I did not mind GOATS for most of the time it was around. I really do like heavy tank compositions, and I always have. I like seeing what teams can come up with beyond the way the game was intended to be played. There was something about watching a team invest so hard in their Reinhardt that I absolutely loved, and of course, the increase in Lucio play was something I was very happy about. Lucio has always been one of my favorite heroes in the entire game, and we pretty much saw none of him back in Season 1, but now Lucio was more important than ever. A good Lucio would dictate the pace and try to make a big play when he could. Then of course you also have the mind game battle between a Zarya and a D.Va. Seeing people like Fury, Choi, and Janu absolutely ruin the day of an enemy Zarya was great, but on the other side of it, watching a high charge Zarya go to town on the enemy was fun as well. All of the intricacies that came with GOATS resulted in some of the most teamwork-oriented parts of the game we've ever seen. It was a lot harder to get away with those individual heroics during this era. Was it still possible? Yeah, of course, but coordination was the main driving force. The bubbles and the speed timings meant just about everything. Combos played a huge role in this too. You had the D.Va bomb into Grav where Ryan charges the enemy shield. It was a classic. Just from a pure teamwork perspective, GOATS was absolutely magnificent. It kind of felt like what Overwatch was supposed to be deep down, but just with a different composition than maybe what the devs intended. I really did enjoy GOATS at its peak, and with it came a lot of rising stars and epic rivalries, the biggest of which is easily the Titans and the Shock. The games those dudes played were always amazing, and honestly, things continued to get interesting even as a lot of teams began to stray away from the traditional GOATS comp. Somber GOATS, triple DPS, original GOATS, what really was the best thing to run? It really depended on the team and the matchup. The differences in philosophy led to some very interesting battles in a rock, paper, scissors type of thing. Teams like the Dragons, Valiant, and Hunters chose to go the DPS and Sombra route, while the Shock and Titans preferred to stick with what they knew. When there was an upset or a close game, we witnessed peak Overwatch. 2019 was a great time to be a fan of this league. COVID did not exist, which meant that we always had a live audience. Now, of course, we were almost always in Burbank, but that still made things way more enjoyable than what we've had the last couple of years. The cheering fans made those games a lot better, especially for the emotional moments. The Dragons winning their first game is something you can never forget. Watching Gaggery and the crying fans was very special, and it only became more special down the road when the Dragons inevitably won the Stage 3 title as underdogs. They pretty much killed GOATS by sticking with the triple DPS. Everyone on that entire squad played so well during this time. That Shanghai team honestly might be the most memorable ever for me, despite them winning the grand finals this year. The same applies for like the San Francisco Shock. That 2019 variant was so dominant, and their rise to the top with championships and a golden stage are some of the top moments in league history. Runaway Vancouver as well as the Spark and Rain with the Fran at the time were also pretty memorable. And we can't forget about the Hunters either. Those guys kept the league fresh. Right from day one, they decided to be different. And because they kept their game so interesting, they earned quite a large following as people appreciated their out-of-the-box thinking and their willingness to actually play DPS. Guys like Among and Jinmu became fan favorites as they confused and stumped even the toughest teams. I mean, that Hunters vs Titans match in Stage 1 is one of the greatest ever. As for my perspective as a Valiant fan, Season 2 was the craziest. It was memorable, and it was very stressful and miserable at the same time. That whole 0-7 thing made me so insanely frustrated, but then Stage 3 came and suddenly I was happy again. The league was fun and my team was competitive during the second half of the year. After thinking their season was over by the spring basically, they managed to keep me on the edge of my seat until that final game of the year. The Stage 3 2019 Valiant are probably my favorite variant of the team. Some of my happiest moments as a supporter of the team came halfway through Season 2. I loved watching Kareev play out of his mind, and I loved watching my guys just be happy again, and I also loved watching them play some of my favorite matches ever. My favorite Valiant game of all time is when they beat the undefeated Titans. That was such a magical time to like this team and be invested in the league. That determination and never quit mentality is what makes the 2019 Valiant hold such a special place in my heart. It made the league as a whole that much more memorable. But you know, Season 2 isn't just special from a fan perspective. I have a lot of love for this year on the content side too. Season 2 is when I first got on the radar, if you will, when it comes to this platform. It's when my channel first started to blow up. March 2019 saw me hit 1,000 subscribers, which is still my most beloved milestone to this day. Season 2 gave me a new perspective on what I could be doing with my life. It paved the way to what I would argue to be a brighter future, one where I don't feel so lost anymore. So much happened during this time. I started to grow quick. I met a lot of amazing people that I'm still friends with today, and I honestly made some of my favorite content during this year. Even before the season started and I began to blow up and everything, I loved evaluating rosters and going over my thoughts on new expansion teams and their logos, their potential rosters, their colors, all of that good stuff. It was a good time. God, I love Season 2. I could sit here all day and talk about the nostalgia because it is off the walls. So many great games, so many amazing players, and some awesome videos. It was a great year that I'm forever thankful for. It changed my life. And while my Valiant ultimately missed out on the playoffs and made me pretty sad, I still had fun watching the league as a whole. The stages were great, and so were the playoffs. And in terms of viewer friendliness, 2019 was great. Tokens were not a problem, and as mentioned earlier, we had the All Access Pass, which really leveled up the whole entertainment and educational value thing. And honestly, something about Twitch chat is just better than YouTube. It's a better culture. But of course, I do have some criticism with Season 2. The first thing is how long GOATS lasted for. While I enjoyed the meta and a lot of the games it brought, it more than overstayed its welcome, let's be honest. That meta lasted for what seems like an eternity. While teams like Chengdu and Shanghai helped breathe some fresh air into everything, it was just not enough in general. GOATS was so powerful. Some people loved it, but others hated seeing the lack of DPS, and I can't blame any of you. I started to miss it after a while too. I especially got tired of seeing DPS players be stuck on Brigitte. That character was so disgustingly good back then, but she was so boring to watch. I missed watching Carpe click heads on Widowmaker and Striker kill things on Tracer, you know? It felt like something was missing after a while. And some of the players, they really hated it too. It felt like interest was fleeting for some of them. And while it's true that we did get DPS by Stage 4, the damage had already been done. Interest had been significantly lowered since GOATS lasted for so long, and 222 was literally forced on us because Blizzard could not balance the game. 222 from like a casual perspective is great, but I think it takes away from the fun that you can have at a pro level. The only cool thing that really came out of 222 from like a DPS standpoint was Doomfist and Mei, who were pretty irrelevant in the league up until that point. I think that also seeing Sigma when he was new was pretty cool, but it still felt very forced. But that's not even where the problems end when it comes to the dominance of GOATS. Earlier I talked about upsets and great games. The ones that happened, they were insane. I think the Seoul vs. New York upset always comes to mind for me, but most of the time, we're not getting those types of games with GOATS. If two top-level teams were not playing each other, games ended up usually being boring. It goes back to team play. If you don't have it down for something like GOATS, you're gonna get destroyed by somebody who does. And that is exactly what happened time after time. There were so many 4-0s or lopsided 3-1s. Watching teams like the Mayhem and the Justice and the Outlaws and the early season Valiant, among others, was absolutely painful. The good games were awesome, but the bad ones basically put you to sleep. If you got supremely outmatched on GOATS, it was some of the most resident sleeper gameplay of all time. Literally the moment that 222 came, the games were usually a lot closer. GOATS was awesome when both teams knew what they were doing, but there were clear-cut skill gaps between those top teams and everybody else during this time. To say that Season 2 was perfect is foolish in my eyes because it had its problems, but compared to the seasons that happened after it, 2019 was a masterpiece. It's a year that I will always treasure no matter what. And finally, at number 1, I have the one and only inaugural season. Yes, this answer is absolutely biased, and no, I do not care. This pick is absolutely with nostalgia in mind. Season 1 started it all for me, and a lot of you. It's what gave me the motivation to try to make Overwatch content to begin with. 2018 during the summer started my journey and led me to a place I once thought never was possible here in the present. My content was nowhere near what it is today. I was still learning the ropes. There was something so special about Season 1 that I just can't relate with any of the other seasons. I don't think I was ever more invested from a general fan perspective, or I guess you could say casually. This is when I was a total geek for the LA Valiant. I wasn't thinking about how to talk about them in a video, or how to be as objective as possible on if they could win a game or not. I just wanted to see them win every game, and I truly believed in them and that every game was winnable. It gave off the same feelings as just about any other sports team I watch. That's also when the Valiant hit closest to home for me, since a lot of the Immortals core was still present. Even when they struggled, every match was fun. I loved watching that entire crew. It was amazing to watch them grow and change and improve over time. Needless to say, life was good as a Valiant fan back then, or I guess I should say former Valiant fan now. You better believe that I enjoyed every single second from start to finish. I wasn't watching every single game on every single week, but I always made time to watch the Valiant in my schedule no matter what. I could watch the league casually back then, and I think that's what made it enjoyable, and it kind of provided a different experience than what I get now. But as the season progressed, I found myself watching more and more of the games, and that's because those other teams became more and more interesting to me. The storylines, the rivalries, it was very easy to get invested into. From Boston having a 10-0 stage to the battles of LA and Seoul versus New York early on, a majority of my favorite matches, I would say, came from 2018. I would say that like 10 of the 12 teams usually had my interest. The alexyOWL, they had their streak of dominance with some of my favorite DPS players of all time, plus Jonak, and then you had Boston and their Stage 3 magic. London, they had their crazy championship run as well as in Stage 1. Philly were super fun underdogs. The Dragons were fun to cheer on as we wanted them to win a game. The Gladiators had the whole thing going on with the Fissure redemption arc. And Dallas had that Stage 4 blow up with Seagull and Taimu, and the list goes on and on. I also think I just resonated with the players the most during this time. They were all OGs. I hadn't watched all of them before the start of the league, but I knew a lot of them thanks to the World Cup, Apex, and other tournaments. And looking back at it, I really miss a lot of those guys. The games used to be played differently back then, and a lot of those guys had it down to a science. So many of those original players are no longer in the league, but I still appreciate all of them and what they did. I was overjoyed to witness so many legends of the game close out their final chapter of this game. The nostalgia hit hard for that reason, but that's not the only reason. I think the way the game was played was also something I really loved. Yeah, the skill level was far lower during this time, but that's kind of the way I liked it. It was a simple time. The philosophy of the game was so different. It still felt like more of what I saw when I first became a fan of esports back in 2017. Maybe it's for nostalgia, or maybe it's because I'm not an expert or anything like that, but the simplicity made things way more interesting to me. Additionally, teams could get away with being more creative with what they ran. Dive was the main premise during this time, but teams didn't always stick with the same 6 or like 7 heroes like we see during the current day a lot of the time. Soldier was actually still viable back then, so some teams actually ran him consistently. Then others got into Widowmaker, then you have a freak of nature like Jake who would break out Junkrat on attack. And of course, there was the classic Slambulance comp, which I really loved because again, it reminded me of the old days. Triple tank was common when I started watching this game professionally. And since the game was so simple and there weren't as many crowd control issues, tank players could pop off a bit harder, and heroes like Genji were actually useful. In fact, they didn't even have an Ana most of the time. There weren't a lot of over-the-top things going on. It was simple, but also chaotic. Dive had a fast pace, which led to a lot of crazy back-and-forth fights where the outcome wasn't always so clear. Then you bring in Mercy, who had the Resurrect feature, and in Stage 1 in particular, she could get the res off twice, which led to a lot of fast pace and really crazy action. For some people, it it felt a bit too messy and just hard to follow, but I honestly preferred it that way. There was always this battle of who could jump on the enemy backline faster. Coordinated dives between the tanks and DPS were some of the best I've ever seen back then, and honestly, even when Brig first came out, it wasn't that bad just because we still got to see a lot of DPS. It was honestly a huge emphasis along with flex support. Those were like the two keys to success back then. You wanted to have a godlike Tracer or, Widowmaker with Prophet and Carpe and people like that, plus a reliable flex support who murdered everything in sight, like Jonak. It was a little sad that there was a lack of Lucio during this time because, again, I love that character, but I really didn't mind that much. Everything else kept me really entertained. People like Fissure put up a show on tank. And then, as I said before, there was always a lot of fun Genji and Widow and Tracer gameplay going on, and having a lot of Pharah made me happy too. I'm a sucker for Pharah gameplay, and we had a lot of world-class projectile players in Season 1's meta, so it was right up my alley. The games, the players, and the meta all hit the hardest for me during 2018. Additionally, overall interest and optimism was at an all-time high. Nobody was complaining back then. The viewership was crazy good, and I saw positivity everywhere. 100k plus people live was pretty typical, and some individual matches hit over 1 million viewers between the live audience and those watching the VOD. And just like with Season 2, it was a very viewer-friendly experience with good incentives and not many technical difficulties. Season 1 certainly was not perfect. I think that Mercy stuck around for way too long, I admit that. She's a boring hero to watch, and that kind of made the main support role as a whole seem pretty unattractive. Dive, I think that also lasted for quite a bit, which did make the meta feel stale at times. A lot of heroes during 2018 did not get much of a spotlight. I really wish that we got to see more Ryan and Lucio for sure. But again, I usually didn't mind that much because I always felt entertained anyway. Maybe it's because the league was so new, or because of the whole nostalgia thing, or just because of the flashy play we saw at DPS and flex support, but Season 1 was my absolute favorite. Something about the Twitch era of the league hits differently. It and Season 2 are clearly above the previous 2 years for me. It's really close, but I do think that 2018 takes it home for me. Disagree if you'd like, but again, this is just a reflection of me. But yeah, that just about wraps up my rankings video. I can't help but wonder how we'll look back at this era of esports as we transition into Overwatch 2, and I can only hope that the new game helps to bring Overwatch esports back on the map, but that's a discussion for a different day. In the meantime, let me know what your rankings are for Seasons 1 through 4 down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, dropping a like and a sub would be greatly appreciated. And as always, thank you all so much for watching this video, I really do appreciate it, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.